last point, just yeah. So the missile attacks on cities have been really quite horrific, So there have been hospitals that were knocked out, and schools and children's theater was destroyed in Mariupol. Mariupol was the first city to bear the brunt of the onslaught. This was a city of about 500,000 people before the invasion, and it's down to about 25,000 people that are now under Russian domination. And because numbers can be very sterile, I wanted to share this image of a rally that was held way back in 2014 when people in Mariupol, it's one of the easternmost cities in Ukraine, and this was a huge rally. You can see that they have this little caricature of Putin with a Hitler mustache, and these are folks that were. I'm sure that a lot of the people in this photo were killed after the invasion started. Many of them were forced from their homes. But the folks in Mariupol, even though many of them are Russian speakers, wanted to make it clear that, we have no interest in being occupied by Russia. We're doing just fine. Just as in Ireland, most people don't speak Irish or Gaelic anymore, but they're still passionate Irish folk, Irish patriots. So these folks wanted to make it clear that they were still, very passionately supportive of Ukraine. But this is, so this is like one of the iconic photos of the rally that took place in Mariupol back in 2014 when Putin decided not to invade just yet at that time. But of course, this was the next image on the next slide. This was in the Academy Award-winning film 20 Days in Mariupol. This was taken by this team that actually was in the city when the hospital was bombed. And this mother, sadly, this mother perished. Her baby died also. But these were just some of the stark images that started coming out. The Russians just indiscriminately bombed the city and the maternity hospitals, and this was one of the scenes. And then the next slide. Donna, you're a good sport for doing all this. I really appreciate your advancing this. But in Ukraine, I mean, on an average day, there are 15 missile strikes. So these are either drones, Iranian drones, or Iskander missiles. And so I often share with my friends, it's almost like when we remember how traumatized we were by 9/11. Every day in Ukraine in the last 3 years has been like 9/11 because you can never know where that missile's coming from. And even though they've adapted to, they can actually track missiles now, and so they can take cover so that there's not quite as much um, death as there had been previously. It's still a horrific thing to go through. So the next slide. Um, yeah, I'm going to just try to go through these. So one of the really epic battles that happened in the early days of the war was at the steel mill, Azovstal, which is on the Azov Sea. And basically you had several thousand soldiers and civilians that took shelter in the bowels of this building. And as you can tell just from this photo of this soldier that was wounded, I mean, conditions there were pretty horrific. It's filthy conditions, certainly nothing resembling a hospital ward. But people took refuge there, and the movie 20 Days in Mariupol was just the first 20 days. That siege lasted for 82 days, just to kind of get a sense of just how long these people held out. And finally, President Zelensky just said, look, I don't want these people to perish because they were getting bombed by cluster bombs and phosphorus bombs and so forth. And he said, I want folks to surrender just to save their lives. And so there was a prisoner exchange, but a number of these even the POWs that were taken were still killed later on in one of the POW camps. So that was another war crime that was committed that violated just the fundamentals of the Geneva Accords. But these are some images of some of these guys that hung out there and tried to put up a defense. And then the next slide. So you had these guys that even were amputees, and they still had to stay there in these underground hospitals. But they held out for 82 days. Just to give you a sense of like how long that is, the Battle of the Bulge, if you remember World War II, the one of the most epic battles with great heroism, the 101st Airborne, they held out in the city of Bastogne for 6 days. And then Patton called in the bombers to bomb the panzers, and they basically lifted the siege. That was 6 days. This was 82 days. And the city of Bakhmut, they were going through bombardment and siege for over 300 days, so almost for a whole year. So these people are just unbelievably tough. I mean, they just hang out. They hang on there for just unbelievable long stretches of time and just refuse to give up. So just the next slide. Um, so just to kind of put it in human terms, as Michael and Barbara Jean were saying, just to me, this was a very tragic. It's not the most tragic picture, but here's a young high school graduate who was really looking forward to her high school prom, and this was the beautiful dress that she bought, and then her school was bombed and she could never go to her thing. But as a statement, she walked out into the rubble of her high school and said, well, this is my statement for, how I refuse to be broken by fate. I'm still beautiful. My city is still going to recover from this. So this is just like, one image that really struck me to the core. Having three daughters, all of whom went to proms at different points, it's kind of a big deal and it's the same, in Ukraine. So the next slide. Um, and there have been all these other horrific things. There's over 600 churches and sacred places that were bombed by the Russians. So this is a beautiful, and some of these were UNESCO World Heritage sites that were destroyed. So this is one of the iconic churches there that you can see, like basically all the iconography, all the mosaics are just destroyed, and these are the two priests that are just kind of looking aghast at what happened. And the next one. Um, Yeah, so um, the magazine, it's an evangelical magazine called Christianity Today, and the evangelicals in Ukraine have now become very politically active because a lot of their communities have been destroyed, and many of their clergy and basically the Russian occupation troops treat like anybody who's not Russian Orthodox as being either an apostate or a sectarian. Or they got all these names for them, but basically they demonize them, and so. Last year when the U.S. Congress finally released the $62 billion in aid that had been held up by Trump and by Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson finally kind of broke down after he was visited by a group of evangelicals from Ukraine who said, look, these are our people that are being killed and tortured and abducted, and our churches that are being destroyed. And finally, that seemed to have moved Mike Johnson. So he even defied, Marjorie Taylor Greene and the other kind of extreme extremists in Congress that were trying to hold it up. But yeah, this is a horrible, horrible thing. And Babi Yar, which is of course a very sacred site that was also part of that was destroyed by Russian bombing in the first days of the war. So next slide. Um, so I just wanted to share a few images, and then I thought I might stop and just give people a chance to ask questions. But about 15% of the Ukrainian armed forces are women, and so these are these two young gals that they look like twins. I think they are twins, but basically people just feel like all bets are off. We have to defend our children, our homes, our what's left of our country, and most of Ukraine. It has still been, I hate to say relatively unscathed because people have suffered terrible personal losses with, family members that have been killed on the front lines. But most of Ukraine is still functioning. I think one of the things that this administration doesn't understand is that, it's not a wasteland. I mean, there's still the economy is still thriving. There's still, businesses that are opening. There's, very sophisticated tech industry, a lot of precision manufacturing and of course agriculture. But the people in Ukraine feel like they've got to defend this, and so even in our university, we've had a number of our students and alumni that have gone out. Sadly, we've lost 30 of our alumni and students that have been killed on the front lines, and these are 20-year-old kids, 22-year-old kids. Some of them were brilliant, had brilliant careers ahead of them. And then I'll just go to the next slide. So yeah, this is what, after they come off the front lines, this is how exhausted they look and, really pretty forlorn. But, and then the next slide, I'll just breeze through a few of these. The other thing that's really horrific, and the Russians have actually admitted that they did this. They've abducted thousands of Ukrainian children and brought them into the interior of Russia. And they've put them through indoctrination camps so that they're trying to get these kids to to renounce their Ukrainian heritage, basically. And so that every day they start with the Russian anthem and they start telling them how horrible Ukrainians are all Nazis and, all this kind of nonsense. And you can imagine for a kid, even for a high school kid, how that kind of trauma begins to wear on a child. These are not kids in Ukraine. This is actually a photo of a lovely Ukrainian dance ensemble here in Hartford, Connecticut, the Zoloty Promin, which is the Golden Rays. But just to give you a sense of, these are the kinds of kids that are being abducted. They cleaned out orphanages and sent them into Russia. And the official number that human rights activists have documented are over 19,000, close to 20,000 children that they've documented where these are kids that the parents are trying to bring them back from Russia, that their parents are alive, that they have somebody to come home to, and the Russians have not released them. There's about 340 kids that escaped on foot from Russia back to Ukraine. And have told horror stories about what they experienced when they were there. But these are I mean, Ukrainians are really proud of their dance culture, their folk music, their art, their filmmaking skills, etc. And so I just, this is I don't want to mislead anybody, but that's the folks that have been documented. The Russians themselves have claimed that they've brought over 600,000 kids out of Ukraine and out of occupied territories into Russia or into occupied territories like Crimea. So, this is just really just kind of just a scandalous, war crime in itself of trying to basically brainwash children and in some cases try to turn them against their homeland. So just two more slides and then I'll stop for a little while. This is a cemetery in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, LVIV, where our university is based. And even though this area has not been as heavily affected, there have been some missile strikes there. But this is a cemetery that up until 3 years ago, I went running through this cemetery because there were no grave sites there yet, and this is now just piled on with all of these. And I have to admit, my nephew Roman is buried here now. He was a infantry soldier. He was a captain in the Ukrainian army. He did 3 tours of duty. He could have bailed out on his assignments because he had already done 3 tours and he has a disabled mom and he's got 2 little kids. But he just kept going back out into the front lines, and sadly, he and his best friend got killed driving over a mine, IED that blew up. But just gives you a sense of like so many of the people whose lives have been lost. And then just two more slides I'll just go through. One of the positive things that's come out of all of this, and it's hard to sort of focus on anything positive, but the Ukrainians pride themselves on the fact that their language, which had been suppressed for centuries by the czars and for a while also by the Polish monarchy, they have really been incredibly determined to keep their language alive and keep their literature alive. So this is just like a little chart that they developed of like all of the official edicts that came either from the czars or from the Soviets banning the Ukrainian language, either forbidding it from being published or spoken or taught in schools, etc. And then the next slide, the good news is that Ukrainian is still spoken by about 40 million people in the world, about 35 million in Ukraine and 5 million in countries like the United States and the UK and Australia and Germany and other places where Ukrainians have emigrated. And so it's a language that's been remarkably resilient in spite of all of this heavy suppression. And for many decades, my sister just wrote a book about this. She's a Loomis grad and was a musician who taught music at Indiana University and Berkeley. And she just wrote a book about the fact that, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the way that Ukrainians were able to get around the prohibitions on their language was that they would go from village to village, actually teaching songs and teaching like Christmas carols and folk songs and ritualistic songs to children, and then also church choirs and synagogue choirs actually help to preserve a lot of the tradition of the Ukrainian language. And so it's actually, quite remarkable that the language has held on as strongly as it has, and it's actually gone through a pretty big renaissance um, over the last few years. And then just the last slide, and then I'll pause for. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, as passionate as Ukrainians are about their own, sort of Ukrainian traditions, our poets and our literary figures that are we don't have founding fathers that were military people for the most part, but they're mostly poets and writers, and their attitude was always that like Shevchenko was the most famous of our poets, and he said, learn what is foreign to you, but do not forsake your own. So there's always been a tradition within Ukraine that people have been encouraged to learn about other cultures, and including ethnic minority cultures. So this is a photo of a beautiful event that took place every year for 16 years in the city of Dnipro, or it used to be called Dnipropetrovsk. Our university, working with human rights activists from the Jewish, Crimean Tatar, Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian communities, would hold these week-long or 2-week-long workshops on where each community would sort of share, the painful aspects of its history, and then also share, the various ways that their communities had suffered through ethnic cleansing or genocide. And this event happened a year before the invasion, but it brought together, these Muslim kids, from Crimea, Polish Ukrainian kids, Jewish Ukrainian kids, and Ukrainian kids, and had really, and so this is one reason why I think many people were surprised that Volodymyr Zelensky, whose Jewish background, was elected by 73% of the population. His ethnicity and his faith background was not even an issue in the election. It was just like he's the best guy for the job. That's why most people voted for him. And if anything, a lot of people have said that since the invasion, the sense is that Zelensky probably would get even higher percentage of the vote now because he's proven himself to be a really competent leader in a wartime situation. A lot of people have compared him to Churchill in terms of his ability to rally both the international community to support Ukraine, but also internally to unify the country. And I think after that Oval Office meeting, a lot of Ukrainians got really furious with the way Zelensky was treated. So I've heard even from friends of mine that had some reservations about Zelensky, saying, "Well, we're all backing him now. Believe me, we love this guy, and he's shown his toughness and his resiliency." So I just wanted to pause at this point, and then I can share a few more slides. But maybe if folks had questions, I could talk, ad infinitum. So I'm going to shut myself down here and invite anybody to ask some questions to make sure that I can address your concerns.
Well, the devastation seems so great where it has happened. How do you foresee that it will ever be rebuilt?
It's a great question, Barbara Jean. I mean, the one thing that we in the Ukrainian community draw comfort from, and it's grim, but we think about what happened in Warsaw at the end of World War II, where you had the Warsaw Ghetto was just obliterated, and you had most of the city was wiped out. My parents fled Ukraine at the end of World War II, and my dad, even as a teenager, remembered what it was like watching the bombing of Bratislava in Slovakia, and those cities were rebuilt. They were rebuilt. That was on the Soviet side of the Warsaw Pact, so that they didn't have the same kind of resources we had. But also, even when we're looking at the Marshall Plan and how cities like Dresden and Köln and other cities were rebuilt, after the war, and those were our enemies. Those were, you know, that I think it really was one of America's finest hours. I think, the Marshall Plan is something that we need to teach our kids about, and we need to remind ourselves about how powerful that was as an act of reconciliation and forgiveness for our enemies. Ukraine is not our enemy. Ukraine has been staunchly supportive of Western values, especially since it regained its independence in 1991. So people in our community feel very strongly that the country can be rebuilt and it deserves support both from the European Union and from the United States. And NATO membership, amen to that, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, if any country has earned its right to be in NATO, Ukraine has earned that right. And I think that one of my biggest frustrations is that, Hegseth, when he started, they were talking about doing negotiations with Russia. And immediately it's like your most powerful card, to the degree that Trump, taunted Zelensky and said, well, you don't have any cards. Well, the biggest card was NATO membership. So why did, as the master of the art of the deal, why are you giving that card away? And I think that the Europeans, what may be an irony to all this is that if the United States backs away from NATO, that I think a lot of the countries in NATO would probably embrace Ukraine. I think, countries like France, definitely Poland, definitely the Baltic countries are very much supportive of that. But even from the point of view, Barbara, of sort of the robustness of the economy. For instance, in our university, we have a very excellent business school. And last year, we brought over 42 relatively young business leaders, like 30 something, 40 somethings. And these were young people that have already built businesses in tech, precision engineering, manufacturing, consumer goods, all that kind of stuff. And they were invited to Stanford Graduate School of Business to upscale their skill sets so that they could get venture capitalists and so forth. Ukrainians have a 93% literacy rate. It's one of the most literate countries in Europe, and that's Europe. Europe's pretty pretty amazing, and so they have a very strong tech sector that can operate even in the underground. As long as they've got generators to work. So even during the war, a lot of these businesses have continued to thrive. And I've met a number of business leaders that are producing things like agricultural equipment and stuff like that. And some of this stuff they've had to move into underground production facilities, but they're tough. They've been able to do it. So that's why I think there really is hope, even though the bleakness of what we're seeing now is tough to take.
Well, and what's this deal with the minerals? What would that do to the country?
Good question. I'm not sure. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Tucson visiting one of our big donors down there, a guy named Ihor Kunash, who is in geologist circles, he's known as Mr. Lithium or Dr. Lithium. He's actually like he just happens to be Ukrainian American, but he is like the world expert on lithium deposits. And he was very sanguine, but also pragmatic. He said that, the lithium deposits in Ukraine they're there. There's some that can be extracted. He said it's nothing like Bolivia or Chile or Australia, which is where most of the big lithium, deposits are. But he says that, Ukrainians being as innovative as they are, they probably could extract them to buy themselves, 10, 15, maybe 20 years worth of production. Some of the precious metals are in the occupied territories where the Russians are. So, that's going to be tricky to see how that operates. But yeah, there's certainly and there's a good deal of natural gas in Ukraine, believe it or not. I didn't know this, shame on me, they but apparently there are substantial deposits of natural gas, and a number of U.S. companies have already expressed an interest in going in there and extracting it. But honestly, I don't know what kind of a deal, Trump and Rubio are trying to drive, and what the terms of it are going to be. Um, but it won't hurt. I mean, as much as I have deep suspicions and contempt for our current regime in Washington, there is a little bit of validity to that, having, Western business people coming into the country would be somewhat of a deterrent against, an additional Russian invasion. So I want to be fair as much as I can be. any other questions from anybody? I can just, do a few more slides afterwards if you'd like.
Sure, why don't we do that and people can percolate?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So let's keep going with the other slides then. Thanks, Donna. You've been a good sport doing this for me. I really appreciate it.
I have a question, Don.
Oh, sure, sure, Jen, go ahead.
I just was trying to get to the better placed. um, Thank you for this presentation. It's so great. And I know this might sound naive, but why isn't someone doing like, why isn't a representative or a congressperson just even giving, 5 of the slides, a presentation for people to be able to see? Like, I just makes me wonder, does the Senate, does the House, like, I feel like some of them don't really have a sense of that, there are these war atrocities going on. And maybe representatives, maybe people have done presentation, just something that's very clear. Like, I feel like taking some of the images that you have and just kind of posting them on social media to let them, hear to Ukrainian women, before going into battle and after. And just anyway, how can people not be moved by what you're saying? I don't understand it.
Jen, that's a brilliant idea. And you're right. I think that, a lot of times, I know we in the Ukrainian American community kind of get bogged down by trying to throw too much information at folks. But I think having some of these images and, really just kind of laying out the the key points that are really undeniable, of just saying, here's genocide writ large. Here's what the Russians have done. They've destroyed churches, they've destroyed hospitals, they've destroyed schools, they've massacred all these people, they've abducted all these children. Boom, 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 just like that. Just kind of go through that. I think that would be. I'll tell you what. I'll talk. I'll talk to Senator Blumenthal's staff about it. Because they do get to sometimes make these statements on the record. That's a brilliant idea. I do know, and this is somewhat also of a hopeful sign, because it's very easy for me and others to feel hopeless about this stuff. There's a handful of even Republican senators like Roger Wicker of Mississippi.
Okay, I was just going to ask you if you knew of some, so that's great that you're giving us the name.
Yes, if you know people if anybody on this call knows people in Mississippi or South Carolina, we need to reach out to those folks because Senator Wicker has been one of the few people that's really countered the disinformation that's coming from people like Tucker Carlson, who's saying, well, there's persecution of religion in Ukraine and Zelensky's evil. There is persecution of religion in Ukraine. It's in the occupied territories. That's where it's happening, And Roger Wicker, to his credit, has been very bipartisan. And I know he invited my boss, the Archbishop, to come and give testimony, and he invited some of these people from the evangelical community and the Baptist community. So, but I think you're right. I think that, we all have limited bandwidth, and to have just, very visceral, blatant outlines of what's happening.
Like even if you took this and, if you culled this down to maybe 6 or 7 slides, including the first ones that are, wow. So a country of 40 million people supplies food to 400 million. I just even that from, even if people are not empathetic at all, just from an economic place. So anyway, because even I know some of this information and I'm still kind of struck by it when I hear it. And I feel like, why aren't other people hearing this,
Absolutely. And, people on the agriculture committee, I have reached out to Jana Hayes because she's on the agricultural committee.
Oh, okay.
And so if any of you are in her district, that would really be helpful to sort of say, she could be a champion on this issue. And especially where so many of the countries affected by the blockade were in North Africa and the Middle East. That's something she could become a real advocate. If you remember last year when the Republicans were blocking any aid to go into Ukraine, Senator Murphy worked with Senator Langford from Oklahoma.
Right.
And Langford really was quite heroic in trying to really package together a deal that both sides could live with. And then of course it got torpedoed by Trump. But
Right.
Langford and I think Inhofe, a couple of these guys were Peace Corps volunteers in Africa.
Ah,
And so we're trying to figure out a way to
yeah.
appeal to their consciences to say, okay, you guys understand at least, you know, you have some sense of what famine or what, severe food shortages look like. So
Right.
you should, and frankly, when I reach out to my, right-wing Christian friends, I say, there's that little piece in the Gospel of Matthew, I was hungry and you did not feed me. You do not
Mhm.
want to end up where those people ended up, in the vision of hell, and
Mhm.
so I
Mm.
do underscore that,
Yeah.
and I think right now, sadly, compassion and empathy have become
Right.
dirty words in the Republican lexicon, which is
Right.
ridiculous. But I do think that we still need to reach out and to say, look, this is a country both that deserves support from our national security interests, but also in terms of what it brings to the table,
Right.
both agriculturally and technologically. I mean, a
Right.
lot of the most brilliant, not to boast, because as Donna knows, my technical skills are sorely lacking. But when I'm looking at some of the people that were instrumental in advancing technology, Igor Sikorsky's from Kiev. He's a Ukrainian
Ah,
guy, you know.
wow.
Steve Wozniak is a Ukrainian American guy who helped to build Apple.
Huh.
The guy who developed GPS is a guy named Mike Aramovich, who's one of our big donors in Florida. Mike worked for Rockwell and worked on the B-1 bomber and all this kind of stuff. So there,
Wow.
Jan Koum developed WhatsApp. These are all Ukrainian people. They,
Ah,
they have amazing capabilities. And so, thinking of how many of these people now are on the front lines risking injury and death, you
right.
know, the world could lose like incredible innovators
Mm,
on
mm,
the front lines. And so we do need to protect that as much as possible.
right. Mm, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think Michael, did you have your hand up? Your mechanical hand?
Yeah. Feel free to
No?
chime in if
Oh, maybe he stepped away for a moment, but maybe he'll come back. Did you want to, we have about another 5 minutes or so. Do you want to do a
sure.
couple of slides?
Yeah, I'll just run through a couple more slides just for, some more visuals. Thank you.
The only reason I'm suggesting is because I'm kind of showing off at this point that I can.
That's great. Yeah. No, but that's great, Jen. I definitely want to pursue that. That would be a really great idea to have, this sort of hard hitting short.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And in a place where people have to look at it. I mean, I know
Yeah.
some of them, sometimes they don't have to go to all their meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted just to underscore is that, Putin is in his sort of propaganda campaign, it's tried to lay out this vision of Ukrainians being these incredibly hostile, crazy, threatening people. It's insane. I mean, it really turns reality on its head because in 30 years of independence, Ukraine has developed, it's really strong reconciliation with all of its former enemies. Poland, for 200 years, Ukraine was under Polish occupation. There were a lot of rebellions and so forth. Ukrainian-Polish relations are at an all-time high. The Poles, welcomed thousands upon thousands of refugees that came in from Ukraine. Turkey, which was, the Ottoman Empire, those guys used to invade Ukraine all the time, like for about 300 to 400 years. Ukraine has developed very healthy relations with Turkey and the Crimean Tatars, the Islamic community, which also was allied initially with the Mongol horde and then later with the Ottoman Empire. Also, these were blood enemies. Ukraine has reconciled with all of those groups and it reconciled with the Russians too. I mean, Russia was its biggest trading partner, and Ukrainians were perfectly happy just to treat Russia as another neighbor, that was, a lot of guys I know went out and worked in the Tumen oil fields or they worked, extracting titanium or coal or whatever. So, Ukraine had no beef with Russia per se until, the invasion started. But the other thing that's so remarkable, which a lot of people tend to forget, is that, from the 1960s, basically since Stalin's death, Ukraine really forged its independence through a series of nonviolent revolutions that I think Gandhi would have been proud of. I think Martin Luther King Jr. would have been proud of. I mean, we had one of our vice rectors at our university spent 10 years in the Gulag, for totally nonviolent, offenses, where basically he just wrote books and poetry and defied the Soviet regime. So, we had like almost 30 years of people that went to the Gulag in protest against oppression. Then after Chernobyl, we had like a lot of the moms were furious that the Soviet regime basically exposed their kids to tons of radioactive iodine and strontium. So they formed a movement called the Green World Party that went out into the streets and said, "Screw you! You'd exposed our kids to radiation. Send us to Siberia, but we're not going to take this anymore." And that was the catalyst for what became the independence movement, the Ruch movement, which was developed very, very quickly and drew inspiration from the Polish Solidarity movement and the Baltic countries. And then there was this student strike in 1990 called the Revolution on Granite, which basically forced one of the top officials in the government to leave. And then after independence, when Kuchma tried to reimpose more draconian laws, they had the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then 2013, 2014, Revolution of Dignity. All of these were like textbook nonviolent revolutions that, the final one, Revolution of Dignity, did end in violence because Yanukovych reached out to Putin and got snipers to come in. They started just shooting people in the streets. And so there was some retaliation on the part of the protesters. But even that was basically, people just rose up against, against the regime in a nonviolent way. So if anything, I think Ukrainians have bent over backwards to be nonviolent as long as they could be. But once Putin threatened genocide, then all bets were off. It's like, well, if you're going to come and steal thousands of our kids, and if you're going to start bombing our cities, at that point, we're going to resist. And just to kind of, again, I've never been prouder of my Ukrainian roots, than over the last 3 years, because I look at this and I say, everybody expected Kyiv to fall in 3 days. France capitulated to the Nazis in 6 weeks. Ukraine's been at it for 3 years, you know, and they've been like, and they've cleared about half of the territory that the Russians used to occupy. The Ukrainians ejected them from most of that area. Kherson, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, all those cities. I mean, it's remarkable what they've done, so that, once forced into armed resistance, they've been incredibly brave and incredibly resilient. So just two more slides and then we can, yeah, let me just see the next one. So this was the Orange Revolution. I missed it. My daughter and my dad and I were there like a month before this started, and I could have been a contender, I could have been there in the streets, but maybe it's a good thing that I wasn't. And then the next one, I'm just going to show a couple more slides of. This is Archbishop Boris Gudziak, who was he's the founder of our university, and this was him speaking to this giant crowd of like 500,000 people on Independence Square every day. For the other way they maintain nonviolent discipline was that every day at noon they would have prayer services, and each of the major religions would take turns leading the prayers. So Rabbi Bleich, who's been living in Ukraine for 30 years and is a very passionate supporter of Ukrainian independence, so he would pray. The imams from Crimea would pray. The Orthodox, the Baptists, the evangelicals, and here's my boss doing his thing. And so, and often they would come together and pray as a group with these ecumenical prayers. So it was their way of sharing that, Ukraine is for all of its people, regardless of their ethnic or their religious backgrounds. And just a couple more slides. And so you'll recognize these guys, right? That's John McCain. So John McCain came and Chris Murphy came. And Chris loves to tell this story. He says, yeah, it was 0 degrees on Independence Square. And here's John McCain showing off what a tough guy he is by taking off his jacket and standing in a sweater. And he said, and I'm like 30 years younger than him, so it behooved me to take off my jacket to look like a tough guy too. But Murphy came back and he spoke to our Ukrainian National Home and to a packed hall. And since then he's been really passionate in support of Ukraine. and the stuff he's been coming up with lately has been remarkably powerful. So we're really grateful to him. And then just one last one. I think this was, yeah, and this was after the snipers started gunning people down in the streets of Kiev. And even then, most people kept nonviolent discipline. They had these like little makeshift shields and stuff, you know. But this is John Kerry and Ambassador Pyatt. And here again, you see that's Rabbi Bleich in the black suit, and then Patriarch Filaret, who's the Ukrainian Orthodox. So all of these guys, and Patriarch, I think Afanasi, who was there. So this was, you know, all of them coming for these prayer services, showing like incredible solidarity between, you know, between the Ukrainian people and you know, their Western supporters. So I just, you know, so these are just some other examples of, you know, how I think Ukraine, and even the thing that's remarkable, you know, there have been about 8 million people displaced, internally displaced in Ukraine since the invasion. There are no refugee camps. And it's because basically people have welcomed, you know, their strangers into their homes, you know, and you know, the churches have stepped up, the various communities have stepped up, and the same goes for, you know, a lot of our friends. I mean, people in Europe have been incredibly generous in welcoming people into their homes as well. But yeah, but there are no refugee camps as such. You know, people are living in tight quarters, but they're supporting each other. So it's another just sign of this kind of like really strong solidarity between Ukrainians.
That was so wonderful. Thank you so much. Jenny's right. You got to do something with these slides because they're beautiful, they're poignant, and I feel like I know things that now that I didn't know an hour ago. I'm very grateful to
Thanks.
you, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming tonight too.
Thank all of
And
you. And I did want to just and thank you. No, I by the way, I field tested these on some other presentations at E.O. Smith School at near Yukon, and I traumatized my poor daughter by doing this for her class in Glastonbury. So she goes like, "Oh no, Dad, please, not you. Do not come to my class. Don't embarrass me." But I said, "What? I mean, you let other people come in and do these anyway." So that's kind of a silly moment. But no, what I did want to mention is that in terms of sort of action items, how people can help, because all of you, I first of all really appreciate your solidarity and, you know, the love that I felt from all of you, and the compassion. I think just Jen's idea and Barbara's are wonderful. And so the few things that I would recommend, if you, again, just to be as creative as you can be, and I will definitely take that to my team, Jen, and pursue this idea of having like these short, hard-hitting, you know, slide presentations. But the other things that you can help us with is definitely if you've got friends or family in some of the red states, Oklahoma, North Carolina, you know, Missouri, they're definitely reach out to them and ask them if they share your feelings about this. I'd be happy to send just like short, like one-page fact sheets to Donna, and then she can disseminate it to y'all. And then, but definitely like Florida and Ohio. The other thing is like everybody, I'm convinced, I'm sure, you know, everybody on this call are college graduates. So at some point in your life, you know, you've had to do a 20-minute presentation about something that you cared about. Um, I strongly recommend to people to submit op-eds and submit letters to editors, and also to reach out to your faith community, you know, whoever they are, you know, to see whether they may respond to this kind of a thing. And then also community groups. You know, the Knights of Columbus have now generated over $25 million in humanitarian aid. Yeah. And Yale, the same thing, you know, Myron Melnick and Andy Zinchuk and those people have done incredible stuff working with the Knights of Columbus. The Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford, you know, David Warner and Lee Pollock have done incredible work as well. So if there, what we can focus on specific goals, like we now have rehabilitation centers for people that are amputees. Our university has an institute of mental health that's like really pioneering, that's doing a lot of stuff on PTSD and working on family counseling and helping you reintegrate veterans back into society, into civilian life and stuff like that. So there's a lot of really creative stuff. So if you know people in the veterans community, in your faith community. And Rotary clubs. Rotary always has that wonderful slogan, service above self. And so, any groups that might be interested in having a public speaker, I'm trying to develop like a speakers bureau, almost like a speakers series. And I've been shaming some of my Ukrainian Catholic clergy into this. See, like you got it. Donna's good. Donna goes out and she does outreach. My people, more often than not, they're sitting behind like closed doors waiting for the little old ladies to bring them pierogies. I said, no, that's not evangelization. You guys got to get out of your comfort zone, get out there and start talking to real people, but we're open, and I've recruited a few people that I think could be really excellent. So we can provide speakers.
Yeah, and we're going to put this recording on our website too. So I mean, unfortunately, I'm so sorry I didn't start from the beginning, but it will live on and people can watch it. So, we'll be, Alex, we're going to be in touch. You have such a lovely spirit, and you're so smart, and just the way you presented was just really, really wonderful. And
thanks.
I think
I
speak for everyone. You moved us all. You really did. So
thank you.
God bless you, the people of Ukraine, and we stand.
Please pray for them, and pray for the other thing that if I may, I think one of the key messages that we need as Americans to send to the administration and to Congress is to say, what is Russia going to give up? Everybody's saying, well, Ukraine's going to give up all this territory. Russia is the aggressor here. What are they giving up? If Trump and Hegseth and Rubio are such tough negotiators, what are you demanding that the Russians give up? That's got to be number one. And I think the other piece of it is that I think also to insist that the United States shows support for a genuine democracy, an embattled democracy that deserves global support. And
well, we ourselves are an embattled democracy.
Yeah, that we are.
Within,
Right.
from within.
Exactly.
From
Yep.
within.
Yeah, we are.
But but there are many people who want a democracy here and want a democracy there. So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And Ukraine can serve as a model. I mean, Ukraine went through totalitarianism, and they know what totalitarianism means. And that's why they're fighting so hard, so that we need to prevent totalitarianism here. And that starts by just telling the truth. When people say a lie, we've got to confront that lie. When they say that, oh, Ukraine started this war, that's just a flat out lie,
Right.
and so demonizing people, I think I'm assuming most people on this call are progressives. So we've been too quiet for too long, and we've sort of been dumbfounded by a lot of the crazy stuff coming at us, and now we've got to respond to it. And
Yes.
So I think that's one way we can fight the evils that are looming out there.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you so
This
much.
is great.
Everybody, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. And this is not the end of our connection with you, Alex, or with the
Thanks.
community. We want to do as much as we can, and we're going to try to get together a benefit too. So that's going to be coming up in the next few months.
Bless your heart.
Bless you, everybody. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Alex,
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you so
God
much.
bless you all. Really love
Bye-bye.
it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. All right. Great to
Bye.
be with you. Thank you. Bye-bye now.